So I thought we'll get underway. We had to start one week or other. It turned out this is the beginning of school holidays and other things, so strictly speaking, we won't normally run the Dean's Forum during school holidays when the choir's not on, whatever. But
have you got it down for next week?
We are, yes, just because I wanted to use this trial period during April, May to give people a taste of what things are possible if we have the 9 o'clock service, because then we can do stuff. Yes, we can do stuff. So I didn't want to wait until kind of sometime in May before we kicked it off. Yeah. So we'll just get it going, and so I'll talk a bit about that in a second. I'm going to record it and put it on the web so people who can't get here can still use it, and not to discourage people from coming, but so that people can catch up if it just happens at one particular Sunday, or every Sunday they just have other things on at 9, 10:30, 11 o'clock, whatever. If we find that, like today, obviously the service went a bit longer, but it did go well. It was nice, and I knew the time was slipping away, and I thought, no, it's just going so well, I'm not going to rush this. So if we find that the Dean's Forum has to start at 11 instead of 10:30, well, that's fine. There's nothing magical about 10:30. It's just that, and ideally you'd actually have morning tea over here, but that's a whole other conversation around all the things that are already in place in terms of the morning tea after the early service. So we don't want to mess with that until we know we're definitely going to stick with this format. But ideally, if people came over here for morning tea, and ideally we had the kitchen renovated and really good facilities for serving. You had instead of kitchen in the next room, if there was a servery where people could come up and it could actually flow really nicely. But at the moment we're just kind of testing a few things without reinventing the wheel.
That's a major reason why the majority of people don't stay back for Thursday, because there's no chairs.
Yeah, and the downside of being over here is you've got to walk from the cathedral to here. But the good side of being over here is that you can sit down and you can mingle. You're not standing on the concrete outside the cathedral kind of thing. But you lose, some people will never come across here, whereas they might stay and have a cup of coffee at the door of the church. So you get there's... Do we have? Well, we have toilets over here.
No pancakes.
Oh, we can organise pancakes or slices. I hear there's a killer slice on offer this morning. We got the recipe. Okay. So let's get underway. So what I thought for these first couple, I just do something really, really basic. And this is, so today is just looking at some 10 really big dates out of the Old Testament. Next week we'll do a similar thing with the New Testament, with the idea that it's simple as if someone stands up or you hear somebody in a sermon doing a Bible reading, giving a sermon, and they mention Joshua, for instance, well, it's nice to know whether Joshua comes before Moses or after Abraham or in between David and Solomon. Of course, some of those are nonsensical things I've just said, but if people have no mental map of, half a dozen big dates in the Old Testament, then stuff just kind of goes and there's nowhere for it to stick. So this is just a way of offering people a chance to just do some really, really, really basic learning. So the idea is, and I should stop standing in front of the projector, shouldn't I? The idea is that just to begin the process of having an adult education program that runs most Sundays after the Sunday morning service. We normally won't do it when there's a big Sunday like Easter Day or Pentecost or whatever. There's enough going on. We all know if we have a fruit tree in the backyard and we just collect fruit off it every year but never put any fertiliser into it, after a while the tree's going to just run dry basically and not produce good fruit. And if we have Eucharist every Sunday, week after week after year after year after year, and never actually do any more intentional kind of fertilising of the garden patch, then we all sort of shrivel a bit. We're running on what we think we remember. rather than getting recharged. So the idea is not to put through any particular program, but just to kind of use the opportunity to grow. I'm hoping we'll find, and I know that is the case, that some of the folk who don't come to church are certainly really interested in coming to this as the process develops. So I'm hoping it'll prove to be another kind of entry point and just a way for people to connect with what's happening and start exploring faith and growing in their faith. It's not a place where you're going to be told what to believe, or these are the 6 things you need to believe, but I hope we'll be able to do it in such a way that we get to explore stuff, and you will, it's like the old thing, if you've got a hungry man, do you give him a fish, or do you teach him how to fish? Okay. Well, I could spend the rest of my time here running Bible study groups and seminars, because that's what I do. I'm a biblical studies professor. No problem. I can talk underwater, under concrete, about stuff. But it's even more important for you to learn how to do it for yourself, not at the level of the academic, but just to feel confident that you can think about this stuff and you can talk about this stuff and you can go to the bookshop and follow up, get a book to follow something up or whatever, because you're learning how to do it yourself rather than to rely on the priest to tell you what the answer is. This is what you do when this happens. We all need to be able to have some degree of resilience in terms of doing that ourselves. So it's going to kind of more or less turn into an online question and answer session, not in the short term. Initially, we don't quite have the facilities to live stream it, but as the new Wi-Fi gets installed and so on, we'll be able to, while we're doing it here live, there'll be people in Kingscliff, for example, joining. They'll be watching and having their own parish discussion based on what they're actually doing that with the sermons already. So the sermons that I give, that I put onto the web, or we video record them, are being used by parish groups and individuals as their curriculum. So one of the ways the cathedral can be a resource to the diocese is that what we're doing here can be made available to other places who may not have a priest at the moment, or may have a priest whose gifts are not where mine are, just as my gifts are not sitting in a nursing home holding somebody's hand for 20 minutes and so on, whereas other people, that might be their gift and something they really are passionate about doing. So if we can make something of the life of the cathedral available outside and beyond, and that will be good, and also it gives people a safe way to check us out. If they're thinking about coming back to church, this is one of the ways they can kind of look over the fence and see what's happening in the backyard without having to walk in through the front door, and because you people are pretty scary. You might jump on them and put them on the roster or whatever, or give them a bag of offering envelopes to fill up and bring back or whatever. So this is one of the ways we can sort of be a little bit more transparent to the community. So anyway, we'll see how it goes. So I've actually got no idea what we're going to talk about in the months ahead. It's more a case of there's plenty of things we can talk about, but let's talk about the things that you want to explore. So if there are topics, or there are questions that you've been wondering about, then that's fair game. We can put them on a list. I'll try and massage them into a coherent kind of series, so we're not kind of shooting off in crazy directions in different weeks. And in the meantime, I will just also put some ideas together about things where we might go. So in a little bit, so this week is going to be Old Testament, next week is New Testament, following week is our 5th Sunday. It's not actually a Dean's Forum, but it'll be in here with the data projector. And we're going to be looking at parish finances and some big ticket strategic items. Then we will have 2 more Dean seminars before Pentecost. So one of them will be, I'm calling it Mapping the Holy Land, but it'll really be an introduction to the geography of the Holy Land. So again, if you have, somebody says, and they went from Bethlehem, or they went from Nazareth to Capernaum, what does that mean? Is that like going to Omara? I mean, what does it mean? Or last weekend, Eve and I decided on the Monday, Easter Monday, let's do a bit of driving out, back. So I said, well, looking at the map, Jacadri looks like a good place to visit. It was a big word, big letters.
Big bridge.
So we found it. We drove all the way out to Jacadri, and we didn't slow down quickly enough when we got off the bridge. So we had to drive like 20 miles before we could turn around. Came back, and that was Jacadri. So I went, okay, let's go to Copmanhurst. So we went the back road to Copmanhurst through Lilydale and through the paddock and opened the gate, across the creek, and had lunch at the hotel at Copmanhurst. But if you have no idea where things are, because you're new in the district, Jacadri looked like, and I heard people say they come from Jacadri, so I thought, well, let's go out and look at the town. There's no town, it's a caravan park.
Yes, you get big ice creams at
Yeah, there's a little shop for the caravan park that sells ice creams and things. But, so having a bit, you need a bit of local knowledge. Well, the same with the Bible. You need a bit of local knowledge if things that are not going to,
There used to be a really big community up around that area. There was a big factory. I don't know if it was tin or they.
Copper mine candy.
There's copper mine further up from,
But there was also around the morning almost very highly populated in those early secular states.
Yep.
Makes it interesting.
Exactly. And so anyway, so local knowledge and so on. So this is a bit about just getting a bit of a top level kind of overview of how Palestine hangs together. And then this one, just because it's really easy for me to do, but it's very specific, is to drill down to the geography of the whole of Palestine to look at what Nazareth was like in the first century. And
I read the Bible from cover to cover recently, and to find a map and get places in the correct position
sure.
was very, very, very difficult.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And the Bible itself is not, I mean, this might be a topic for one Sunday. If you start at page 1 and work your way through the Old Testament to page 967 or whatever, it's not some bits are in a sequence, but other bits are not. And so it's not like the book club where you get a book and you read it from cover to cover. It's more like a dictionary that you look up particular bits rather than you don't read a dictionary from page 1 to the end. You look for the bits you want, and it's a bit like that. So that's the plan. We'll see how it goes. So let's start. We're going to talk about a handful of key moments, as it were, in the Old Testament. So I thought before I give you my list, let's just kind of pool our knowledge. So what are the dates? If you're thinking about the Old Testament, so that's the bit of the Bible before Jesus, just in case anybody wasn't on that bit. So what will be, from your sense of the Scriptures and having been coming to church for 125 years, okay, so what are like even half a dozen really big moments or dates? You may not put a date to it, but half a dozen really big moments in the Old Testament story. Any ideas? Yeah.
Well, the first is the Exodus from...
Sure, okay, the Exodus, the Israelites coming out of Egypt, being set free, liberated, Exodus. And that's in the book of Exodus, as it turns out, which is the number 2 book when you started to read. Okay, yeah. Now, putting a date on that, of course, is much more tricky, but we'll talk about that in a second. Noah's Ark, okay.
700 BC.
Add a few, add several hundred years. We'll come to that in a minute. Yeah.
40 years in the desert.
Yeah, that's right. So we'll talk about some dates. So Exodus is one. You're saying Noah's Ark. Okay. So why would you say that's a big moment? I mean, the Exodus coming out of Egypt, we understand it's the liberation of the nation, whatever. Yeah. So I'm not disagreeing. I'm just wanting you to unpack it a bit.
I think it's a big event. I think it's a drawing in of the resources that are put on the earth to preserve the future.
Okay. All right. Because it won't be on my list in a minute because I didn't think of putting it there because for me it's not it's a moment in the storyline, but it's For me, it's not an event that happened. So that's one. You've got like two possible.
Red likes earthquakes, not floods.
Yeah, well, you.
Could be an event.
Well, a flood is an event. I grew up in Lismore. We had floods twice a year. That wasn't a problem. But that particular story, we'll come to it. It's in a bit of the Bible where it's impossible to put any dates on the stories. They're like the Dreamtime stories of the indigenous people, and they do. I mean, you're right. The flood story is God saying, "Well, that was a bad idea," ripping the bit of paper out of the book, scrunching it up, throwing it away, and saying, "Now let's start again." So, I mean, that's a really big idea. Okay, and it's a really important idea in the Old Testament, actually, in terms of how the story all hangs together. But whether it's actually something that happened, given what we now know about the world, if you think the world is only a couple of 100 miles wide, then a flood can cover it. Once we know the world is a globe and it's mostly water anyway, then what does a flood story mean?
That's one thing that
Yeah.
always is a question in my mind, because
Yeah.
in the case of a study once before, I heard it sort of discounted, and I was too probably embarrassed to say,
Sure.
is all this teaching you've had about Noah's not really true?
Yeah, yeah. And that's a really big question because, yes, if somebody is standing up front like I am and they're supposedly the expert and they've supposedly studied this or even taught it for 30 years or whatever, and they suddenly say something that you've never heard before or debunks something you've always believed, whatever, then that's a kind of, whoa, hang on. So that will happen in this kind of a process, but you also need to know that it's okay to say, can we just slow down a bit? Can you unpack that? Because that's like, I've never thought about it that way before. But it's not like we have to get, even today, we don't even have to get to number 10 in the 10 most important dates. We don't even have to get there if this conversation turns out to be the most important part of the day, because the lessons out of this bit are actually relevant to everything else we're going to do. So, yeah, so one of the, and I do mention this right at the very end if we get there, one of the questions is, what is the relationship between historical events and biblical story? And have we, in the West, in the last 400 years or so, since the Enlightenment, have we mortgaged our idea of truth to historicity? In other words, unless it actually happened, we don't think it's true. And yet there are stories that didn't happen that are very, very true. Like, where it's very, very true that for Australians, the idea of mateship is a really important thing we all aspire to. But where did that come from? There was not like there were two mates who kind of started the mateship tradition, and yet there are stories out of the bush about matemanship and so on. Sorry, mate. Yeah.
Handed down the Ten Commandments to
Okay, so you go back on the list. Okay, yep. So you've got things. Well, let's not discount. So we've got Noah's flood. I thought someone might say creation.
Yes.
It's kind of
In the beginning.
in the beginning. Yeah, step one, creation.
Before
Okay.
the beginning.
Well, before the beginning is not in the Bible, not in the Old Testament. We're only looking at, I'm going to hide now, we're only talking about 10 most important events in the Old Testament. And the Old Testament doesn't talk about before the beginning. Genesis 1, it talks about in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, but that's the beginning. It doesn't say what was there before.
Can I just say, on ABC, there's the program Think Tank.
Yep.
And at the end of it, there's a question possible we all and I don't know the answer to. And this particular question was, what was the thing that existed before, well, creation's my word, but that was what they were saying.
Yeah.
And
In the
no one
Bible or in Greek mythology? Because I think I saw the same night's program.
probably did.
Yeah.
I don't know about that. No, I don't know if they mentioned the word the Bible, because that was the question, and no one, and the person who could have answered the question did not know. Their answer was K-A-O-S, and that's what my family
Yeah.
call
Okay. It's
I
actually
related-
CHAOS.
Yes,
It's only KAOS in Maxwell Smart.
absolutely, thank you.
The Russian intelligence operatives are from Chaos.
Yeah.
Because that's a story about good and evil, remember?
Yeah.
The Maxwell Smart. Was that his actual name?
Get
Get Smart, yeah.
It's not.
Get Smart is actually a modern myth about good and evil. I mean, Maxwell's always a dummy, a bit dumb, but he's kind of he's the good guy, and the chaos people are always dark sunglasses and heavies. And then number 99 doesn't get a name because she's a girl, but she's there to kind of rescue Maxwell all the time from being stupid. That's the fairies' tale tradition of the Western world.
He rang a bell with me, and I did go back to the Bible, and I have read there somewhere about the chaos that existed before. I don't know if it's in the New Testament.
Yeah, in the-
New
okay,
Testament
okay.
thing or an Old Testament
That's a really good question. Let's leave that one because that's a big topic. So, but keep that. Remind me to talk about creation stories someday, because depending how you translate the Hebrew, and this is very technical, but Bereshit bara Elohim haaretz v'hashamayim. That's the first sentence in the Hebrew Bible, Genesis 1 verse 1. It depends whether that's an absolute sentence or a temporal clause. In other words, is that full stop after God created heavens and the earth, or is it when God began to create the heavens and the earth, comma, the earth was already a formless void, and chaos and darkness covered the face of the deep. Right? So is the chaos there before God begins, or is the chaos part of the creation process that God initiates, according to Genesis 1 verses 1 to 3? Okay? So it's actually a big thing. People argue for hours about whether that phrase that I just said, whether that's a principal clause or a temporal clause. And God goes, now, about justice, about looking after creation, whatever, about child abuse in the church. Come on, guys, focus on the topic. But that is one of the issues, because in the pagan creation myths, the world is chaotic and dark and terrible, and there's a war between the gods, and one of them wins, and they chop their enemies up, and out of their body of the defeated enemy, they create the physical world. Now, that's not quite the story in Genesis 1, but there's bits of it still in there. So, but that's too big for today. But that's that's an example of a really good topic. Yeah. So, creation, Noah's flood, Exodus, Ten Commandments. I haven't got out of the desert yet.
Where are we ended? What's the last one? What's the last topic in the 10?
Oh, okay, good point. I see. You're
So
the sort of guy who reads the last chapter in the book.
we've got to get an end.
Yeah, okay.
So we know.
Well, because we're talking about the Old Testament rather than the story of the Jewish people, my suggested number 10 is when Ezra and Nehemiah are back in Jerusalem rebuilding the city walls, and they get everybody together and they basically say, here's the Bible. And that's in Nehemiah chapter 9. It's not quite as obvious as that, but that's basically what's going on.
Right.
So my number 10 is Ezra and Nehemiah around about 400, 450 BC.
Third, going into Canaan.
Yep, conquest of Canaan, Joshua, yep. Any other moments? And you've got them in the right sequence, which is good.
Yeah, I read the Bible.
You've read the book recently. Have you seen the movie? Yes. Okay. Yep. And then, so what comes after Joshua? Well, eventually there'll be David, maybe Solomon. And so, King David, He's just David to me, but King David. Yeah. King David to me, Bucko. Yep, all right. Yep. And eventually you get things like the north and the south kingdoms being separated, and so on, the destruction. So we're sort of into my list of 10 now, but okay, that's all right. Let me take you there. Okay, so this is a drawing, even though it says St Francis College 1990. That was a drawing I did for my very first parish at Deception Bay when I had long, dark, curly hair. All right, so it was a long time ago. All right, and there's a New Testament one as well. So I'm just trying to put the story, and to fit it on the page, I've used a wriggling line, as you can see. Now, there's more than 10 things there, but that's what we've just been talking about. Okay? Stories about creation and the flood. There's the boat, Tower of Babel. You've got all that stuff back in Genesis 1 to 11. You've then got the stories of Israel's ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, who nobody mentioned before. That's okay? Then you've got the slaves in Egypt, so I just did a sphinx and a pyramid as a way of reminding it. See, I was quite artistic in those days. The Great Escape, the Exodus, being led by the sort of column of fire and cloud. The Ten Commandments at Mount Sinai. The wilderness wanderings. It looks like they're in sort of Mexico, Arizona, but you get the idea. That's not the kind of lands they have in Sinai. Conquest and occupation of Canaan. The period of the Judges. Samuel the prophet. Saul, David, and Solomon as kingship gets kind of set up. Divided kingdoms, Israel and North. Years of conflict and crisis. This is the time of the prophets. This is Elijah, Elisha, and other prophets who will follow, even more so down here, with people like Micah and Hosea and Jeremiah and so on. They're all in this patch through here. It's a major religious reform thing that happens in Judah. Eventually Jerusalem, earlier on Israel is destroyed by the Assyrians, 722. Judah survives for another 150 years, eventually wiped out by the Babylonians. Here they are all being marched off into exile. Very creative in those days. Babylonian exile, they're allowed to come home in 539, and by the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, the Jewish people are known not as the people of the temple so much, but they're called the people of the book, because they have the Bible. It's not the whole of the Bible, but at least it's the Torah, the 5 books of Moses. Okay, so that's my overview of kind of the Old Testament in the way that the Old Testament tells the story. If you ask me to put up a list as a historian, it'd be a very different list. But this is the way the Old Testament tells the story. Okay.
Isn't it held in the covenant in the tabernacle?
Well, so you'll be reading it too recently. According to the book of Exodus, Moses is told to write down all the laws and put a copy inside the Ark of the Covenant, which then goes in the tabernacle. That's right. But the Ark of the Covenant long since disappeared. If it ever existed, it's long since gone.
In the secret room
it was in the Holy of Holies inside the temple and so on. Okay. And so at the very least, it disappeared in 586 when Nebuchadnezzar, one of the few Mesopotamian kings whose name you probably know, Nebuchadnezzar, his army captured Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, and took all the gold, took all the chalices and everything as booty off to Babylon.
and they gave it back.
Well, not that stuff, no. See, when they're sent back, interestingly, when they're sent back by the Persians, they're sent back with the book. They're not sent back with the gold, with the Ark of the Covenant and all that stuff.
Didn't they write the book when he was in exile?
Well, which book? See, so that's what if this is when the Old Testament begins to emerge into view. It's been created in the last couple of hundred years before. Okay, because for instance, when in the days of the prophets, when the prophets are criticizing Israel for bad behavior, having idols, all kinds of other things, the easiest thing to do would have been to say, you can all read the Bible. You know that Moses said we're not supposed to do that. Now the prophets don't say that, because those books didn't exist at the time of the prophets. But by the time the prophets are finished and the people are coming back from exile, these books not only exist, but they're starting to function in in the life of the community the way that the Bible functions for us now. So back here, they're the people of the king, people of Jerusalem, the people of the temple. By the time they're down here, they're the people of the book. And it actually doesn't matter if they even live in Jerusalem, because even if they stayed in Babylon or they moved to Egypt or they go to Turkey, they're still the people of the book. So, and that's a huge idea. Up until here, the idea was if you wanted to be the people of God, you had to go to the town where God's temple was. By the time you get here, if you want to be the people of God, read the book. See what's happened? Totally different way of thinking of what it means to be God's people. No, you don't have to do the sacrifices. You don't have to have priests. You don't have to have temples. Read the book. So now the Bible is starting. It's not the whole Bible, but the Bible is kind of in view by round about 400 BC. Whereas you won't find any people back here like Samuel, and Saul and David and Solomon. They've never heard of this thing because it didn't exist back then.
That's the evolution of the Bible.
Yeah, well, it's
the people.
so the text emerges out of the lived experience of all this, and then the text takes on a life of its own as a kind of a portable. It's almost like back here they like to think they've got the Ark of the Covenant and God's in the box. Down here they've got a portable Ark of the Covenant, it's called a Bible. And they take it with them. But then of course it has to be translated from Hebrew into Greek, because most Jewish people in the Hellenistic period, after Alexander the Great, well, no Jewish people speak Hebrew. They either speak Aramaic or Greek. And so the Bible gets translated into Greek and then eventually into Latin. So again, it becomes, whereas you can't translate a temple into Greek. Okay? You can't take the temple with you, you've got to come to the temple. Whereas the scriptures, once you get the idea of it's in the scriptures, then you've got a whole different kind of religion beginning to emerge. Anyway, here's my 10. And I didn't go way back, I didn't go back into creation and Noah's Ark and so on. I just tried to look at characters or events which are kind of are or sound like they're historical. So I've got Abraham, around about 18. I'll give you this in a bigger picture in a second. So we've got about 10 items there. If I break it in, and they really fall into two parts. The first 5 are before, when Israel is imagining where it came from. Okay. And you've got stories about Abraham around about 2000, 1800 BC. Again, it's impossible to date those stories. The Exodus is normally dated around about 1250, 1280, something like that. Some scholars would say it's about 1450, 1480, but it's certainly, it's either, in historical terms, it's either late Bronze Age or early Iron Age. That's the difference in the dating. Okay? So there's at least 600, maybe even 1,000 years between Abraham and Moses. That's a long time.
A lot happens in that time.
Yeah, well, you think about, even if you said, well, that's like 600 years, okay. But if you went back 600 years now, okay, what's that, Richard II or something? I mean, it's not even Shakespeare, it's not even Elizabeth I, it's not even Henry VIII. It's going back into medieval England, Chaucer, Canterbury Tales. Yeah, well, probably just after the Vikings, but certainly, it's after William the Conqueror. Okay, so, yeah. But yeah, that's so 800 years for us, 800, 900 years from us, takes us back to William the Conqueror, more or less. Okay? So a lot's happened here. Then you've got a shorter period of time between Moses and Joshua, conquering the land, a couple of hundred years before David captures Jerusalem, again, according to the story. And then within a few decades, according to the Bible, the people of Israel split into two kingdoms. A northern kingdom with about 80% of the population called Israel, what today we call the West Bank, which is kind of ironic because that's the Palestinian bit. And the bit in the south was called Judah. Okay, so that's, now if you look at these dates, they're all kind of big picture dates. Yes, like Abraham is 1200, 1800. The Exodus is around 1300. The conquest is around about 1200. David's around about 1000. In other words, we don't have dates for these things. We've got approximate time spots. Yeah.
One serious question. When Abraham took the slave from a wife and had and eventually threw her out and she went into the wilderness, is that where the Islamic faith began?
Ah, wow! That's went in a slightly different way at the end than where I thought it was going to go. Okay. As a historian, I don't think Abraham existed, or the things that are said about Abraham. I think Abraham is a way of gathering up traditional stories about the ancestors. But certainly the way he behaves is the way any wealthy patriarchal leader behaved in the second millennium, first millennium, and frankly, still today. Rich and powerful men tend to have lots of sexual partners. And they either collect wives or they dispose of wives as they go along. So that's true. I mean, it's not, whether it happened or not, it's true. That's what happens. For the Jewish people, Abraham is like, he's the first believer. He's not a Jew, he's a Hebrew. And we might talk about that some other time. But because Jew comes from the tribe of Judah. Okay, so Abraham is not Jewish, strictly speaking, but he's the ancestor of the Jewish faith. Of course, for Muslims, Abraham is the first Muslim. Because what is a Muslim? A Muslim is somebody who finds peace, salam, by being obedient to God's will, and that's what Abraham did. So from the Islamic perspective, Abraham is the first Muslim. From Paul's perspective in Romans, Abraham is the first believer, because he's the one who trusts God and says, even though I'm 99 years old and I'm completely impotent, I'm still going to believe that I can have children. So different religious traditions. And he says, not historically, it's not the origins of Islam. The origins of Islam are the Prophet Muhammad, and he died. And that's really the 6th century AD, with the Hajj and so on.
600.
Yeah, in the 600s, and the late 500s. Yeah.
Is that when Muhammad came?
Yeah. So, but he understood himself to be one of a line of prophets, of which Abraham was the first. So depends who you ask as to what. So from a Jewish perspective, Abraham's son Ishmael is the father of the Arabs. But we shouldn't confuse Arab with Muslim. I mean, most of the Arabs became Muslim later on. But my Christian friends in Palestine are Christian Arabs and have never been Muslim, never been converted from Islam. They've always been Christian. Their families have been Christian for 2,000 years. So I try to distinguish between saying, if I mean Muslim, I mean people of the Islamic faith. If I'm saying Arab, I'm meaning people of a particular ethnic or cultural identity.
Christian faith.
Yes, but different. There are different East. I mean, the Egyptians, strictly speaking, are not Arabs, but they've adopted Arab identity somewhere in the last 1,000 years. So these are big picture dates, and you can see where they fit. This is the beginning of God calling the people who will worship God and only God. This, of course, is the Exodus, the Ten Commandments, and so on. This is the land of Canaan being taken for the Jewish people. This is Jerusalem becoming the capital, and David, the idea that David had a big kingdom stretching for hundreds and hundreds of miles. And we'll talk about that more when the week where we do the geography. Okay. It's a bit like saying they were in Tasmania and they had an empire that stretched for 10,000 miles. But Tasmania is not that big. So, yeah, that's a question. And then you get this, what's going on between the Northern Kingdom and the Southern Kingdom, and there's virtually a civil war for like 200, 300 years. And prophets like Hosea and Amos and Elijah and Elisha and Jonah, they belong to the north. And prophets like Micah and Isaiah and Jeremiah and others, Obadiah and blah, 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 they belong to the south. And they've all ended up in the one book. So something has happened after the Civil War ended, after the Northern Kingdom is destroyed by the Assyrians, something happens. So I call that first 5 Israel imagines what their ancestors were like, because they don't really have dates, they've just got stories. And this one I'm calling Israel remembers, because these are things that actually happened, and we can actually, in the case of the Babylonian siege of Jerusalem, you can pick up the arrowheads off the dirt in front of the rock wall in the city of Jerusalem. We know it happened. I mean, it's like finding the empty gun shells. You know the battle happened because you can find it. You can find the leftovers from the battle. So 722 is a kingdom of Israel, and their capital city, Samaria, is captured by the Assyrians, not Syrians, but Assyrians. What today is the Kurdish area in the north of Iraq. Okay. 586, about 150 years later, Jerusalem falls to the Babylonians, which is southern Iraq in today's language. Okay. So think what's happened already. We're talking about a kingdom, a place, which is in between the rock and a hard place. The rock is Mesopotamia. What today is Iran, Iraq, and so on. And the hard place is Egypt, which is another huge civilization based on the sort of Nile River. So the urban civilization of Egypt and the urban civilization of Mesopotamia, they are the world powers of the ancient East. And Israel is this little tiny place in between, who's always being pushed around by the big neighbours.
Very significant place.
And in terms of world history, so unimportant. For the most part, the Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians don't even if they captured Jerusalem, it's not even mentioned in a footnote because it was too insignificant. Okay. Now we think it's the most important place in the world, but that's because of our faith story. For the generals of the Babylonian army, it was just another city, just another conquest, just another pile of rocks. Don't pay your taxes, we cut your throat. Simple. Okay? So, and again, Babylon itself doesn't last very long in this particular iteration. The Persians emerge, and of course, the Persian Empire is going to last for about 300 years until Alexander the Great emerges on the scene. 622, so that's actually out of sequence, and that actually belongs back up here. I'm not sure quite. Oh, I know what, I decided to change one of my 10 last night, and I didn't take it up to the right spot. This one belongs up here, between 722 and 586. Something happens in Jerusalem, and we give it the really ugly name, Deuteronomic Reformation, because this is when the book of Deuteronomy basically starts to emerge. And everybody says, oh, we better do what's in the book. Okay. So one more, which I've already mentioned, Nehemiah and Ezra, around about 400, well into the Persian period, well before Alexander the Great knocks down the Persian Empire. You have Nehemiah and Ezra, which in the Hebrew Bible are the same book, one single book. In the Greek Bible, they got split into 2 books, and that's why there are 2 books in your English Bible. And they're all about the city, the temple, and the book. And that's really That's where we still are, isn't it? The city, Jerusalem, the temple, should we have one, should we not have one? And because there are powerful groups in modern Israel who want to knock down the Dome of the Rock and build a third Jewish temple there. Okay? The city, you think it was bad when they bombed Syria yesterday. Imagine what's going to happen when they blow up the Dome of the Rock. Okay? The place is going to go feral. The city, the temple, and the book. For Jews, it's the city, the temple, and the book. For Muslims, it's the city, the temple, as in the mosque, and the book, the Quran. For Christians, is it the city, the temple, and the book? Or is it Jesus and the church and the book? You can see what's happening. Jesus is replacing the temple, the church is replacing the city, but we still have the book.
Is that the last Bible
It is, in my list.
in the Old Testament?
No. We'll come back someday to how the Old Testament is organised, because the historical books, as we tend to call them, are not the books that finish the Old Testament in English. The books that finish the Old Testament in English are the prophetic books. So in our Bible, the last book of the Old Testament is Malachi, which is a prophetic book. But in the Hebrew Bible, where it's organised differently, and it was their Bible first, the last book is actually the book of Chronicles. And the guy who wrote Chronicles also wrote Nehemiah and Ezra. So in the Hebrew tradition, yes, this is the end of the story in the Hebrew Bible. So good questions. You've been just sitting there quietly for 6 months, not letting me know what's going on up here. Excellent. Quiet achiever.
I've got a lot of questions.
He's been around a long time. He was parish councillor in 1954.
I was still in nappies in 1954.
My greatest success was building the offshore.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's made a difference, eh? Okay, so. So these are, and we'll come back and look at some of that in a second, but these are those really big questions that I mentioned earlier on. We've got that story, and we can work out 5 dates, and there's no magic about 5 big dates, 10 big dates, 12 big dates. It's just a memory trick. Okay? Why do we have 10 commandments? Because we have 10 fingers. It's a teaching trick. Okay? Why do we have 3 pigs and 3 bears in Goldilocks? And why did I have 3 points when I was talking to Willie? Because that's what you do when you're talking with children. And indeed, that's what you do when you're talking publicly. You tend to have 3 points. People can remember 3 points. Okay? This is ancient. This is when things happen orally rather than in books. Then things like 3s and 5s and 10s become really important because they're memory tricks. Okay? So we have 10 commandments because there's 5 for God and there's 5 for your neighbour. Okay?
What fascinates me is that the memory tricks we're talking about now were evident way back there. You know.
Of course they were, because way back there, most people couldn't read and write. But they still knew stuff.
But they became.
Remember when we used to know all our friends' phone numbers? Do you even know your own phone number today?
One of them.
Yeah, okay. So you see the problem. The brain gets lazy if you're not using it. Use it or lose it. So in the ancient world, you had various sort of memory devices, mnemonic and other devices, which allow the storyteller to remember the sequence, and it also allows the listeners to say, hang on, you left out the bit about so-and-so because you've only told us about 4. 10 Commandments is even more interesting because there are 11 commandments in the 10 Commandments. You go back and count them sometime in Exodus 20. There are 11 commandments. And if you look at a list of the 10 commandments from the Lutheran Church, the Catholic Church, and from the Jewish synagogue, they rearrange the first 3. Okay, they combine different commandments because we all know there had to be 10 commandments in the Decalogue. That has to be 10, right? We all know it has to be 10. But there are 5 commandments about God. There's a commandment about honouring your mum and dad, And there are five commandments about how to treat your neighbours. Okay, so that's 11. So the first 5 get squashed down to 4, and then the look after your mother and father becomes commandment number 5. But they're actually 11, and Jews and Protestants and Catholics number the first 3 or 4 differently, so that by the time you get to honour your father and your mother, it becomes number 5. We all agree that's number 5. Because we know there have to be 10 commandments, okay? There can't be 11. But there are. Okay, because it's simple. 5 for God, 5 for your neighbour. Okay. What's fascinating is the prophets never quote the 10 commandments. The prophets never say, hey guys, remember in Sabbath school, what was the first lesson the rabbi taught you? Well, there's 5 for God and there's 5 for man, and don't forget your mum and dad as well. Okay, so eventually they get twisted in to make up this combination package. So we've got the story. And one of the questions then becomes, for some people, not everybody wants to go here, but some of us are curious. Some of us don't care how electricity works, we just want to put the switch works. Some people don't care how the computer works, just open it up, press it. Other people want to tinker with it. So for some people the question becomes, so how much of that story is historical? How much of it actually happened in the way that the Bible says? Like, there's no question that Jerusalem became a Jewish city at some point in the Iron Age. Whether David captured it or somebody else did, one of the Jewish people captured that city and made it their capital. That's a given. We know that happened. The question is, did David do it? Or was it assigned to David because he was the archetypal king, so he was a good person to be he must have been the guy that captured the city rather than somebody else. Because before that it was not a Jewish city, it was a Jebusite city, it was a pagan city. So we know at some point Jerusalem changes from being a Canaanite town to being a Jewish town, or became Jewish. So that the fact is there, but where you schedule a fact, when did it happen and who was the leader of the army, that's a bit trickier to pin down. Okay? So one of the big questions for us then becomes, once we become aware that there is potentially a difference, then how does this impact on my faith? Is my faith so closely bolted on to the Bible being literally true that as soon as I discover that no, the world wasn't made in the last week of October in the year 4004 BC, and that Adam and Eve were not created at 9 a.m. on the 26th of October, as some people believed in the 18th century, Bishop Usher of Ireland believed that. So Darwin was a rude shock. And dating the earth and realising fossils were not put into the rocks by the devil to trick us. I mean, that was just how old the world is. Trees have rings and the earth has layers. And they're not there to trick us. They're actually there for us to discover what a beautiful and wonderful world we're in. So what is the link between history and faith? And of course, say a philosopher would say, what's the link between philosophy and faith? And Stan Musserud would say, what's the difference, what's the link between the earth and the environment and faith? Because these are all connected somewhere. I mentioned earlier the idea of mortgaging truth to historicity, and the more heavily we sold our faith to the mortgage of historicity, then the more this becomes problematic. Because if it's really, really, really important to us that God did make the world in 6 days, then we've got a real problem when the scientist or the philosopher or the priest says, no, that's not what happens. And then we've got to say, well, so what does it mean when we say we believe in God the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth? Comma, pause, of all that is, pause, seen and unseen. Yeah, so we've sort of got used to doing it in some areas because we're no longer taking all that stuff literally. don't take all that stuff literally, but where's the line? At what point do you say, no, you can't cross that line? So it becomes, so this gets into the question of certainty, and faith, and being confident, having a sense of, it's okay, I can manage this, I can navigate my way through this. One last comment, and feel free to throw comments in. Let me talk about this idea of trends in Old Testament scholarship. Way back, when you were still a young member of parish council, okay? very young member of parish council a long time ago. And I started my theological education. So I did year 12 in 1969, so I was just too late to do any of that stuff. But when I first started, but basically in the 60s, but I was actually 1970, but the trends of when I started theological study, what people were arguing about in terms of biblical history was whether or not Abraham was a historical figure. Lots of energy, lots of research going into trying to prove or disprove that Abraham was a historical figure. Nobody argues that anymore. It's gone. When I started teaching at the seminary about 15, 20 years later, the really hot topic was, what's the date of the Exodus? Is it the 15th century date or the 13th century date? When did Moses and the Israelites come out of Egypt? When did it happen? No critical, scientific, biblical scholar any longer argues for the historicity of the Exodus. Reality is, Palestine was always part of the Egyptian Empire, and if you wanted to escape Egypt, you had to go a lot further than Canaan. Canaan was just the northeast province of the Egyptian Empire, and anybody who lived in Canaan paid taxes to Egypt and thought of themselves as slaves of Egypt. So being liberated from Egypt did not mean crossing the border that says, farewell from Egypt, please come back soon. Okay, another one saying, welcome to Canaan, your new home, okay, land that flows with milk and honey, not. Okay, real estate slogan. Anybody who lived in Palestine prior to Alexander the Great, and maybe even later than that, up to the Roman time, either were or were potentially slaves of Egypt. And when they weren't, it was usually because they were slaves of Mesopotamia. So the idea of being liberated from Egypt works even if you haven't even shifted out of your house.
In that time, many Jewish people left Egypt or the area around Jerusalem and went to other countries because of personal interference of other kings coming and raiding.
Just clarify, when you say around that time or at that time, which time period are you talking about?
Well, prior to, say, the
so we're not talking about Moses, you're talking about the Hellenistic period or the Persian period or the Hellenistic period. Yeah, okay. I see what you're saying. Yeah, you're right. So what does develop is that after these double, triple destructions, Samaria is conquered twice and then totally kind of destroyed. Jerusalem is conquered or captured twice and eventually totally destroyed. Some of the people living around Jerusalem ran away to Egypt to find security. Egypt wasn't just a scary place. If the Babylonians are after me, well, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? So if you're the Babylonians and you're after you want to cut my throat, I'll go to Egypt because they'll be nice to me, because if you hate me, I must be okay. So you get this kind of thing going on. So so what develops is in Egypt, but also in Mesopotamia, and eventually in places like Antioch, and through what today we call Turkey, through into Greece, you get this Jewish diaspora. And Paul was a member of the Jewish diaspora from the city of Tarsus, which is southern Turkey today. He was sent to school in Jerusalem to study with Gamaliel, so his family were very serious about their Jewishness and wealthy enough to send their kid to be an international student in the Shula in Jerusalem with Gamaliel. So, but you get this diaspora, and those diaspora people were very attached to Jerusalem but didn't see any need to live there. It mattered to them, but they weren't going to go and live there because their life was in the new city, wherever it happened to be.
As a Christian, do I say all that period in the Old Testament is half historical, half make-believe or whatever, and the little bits of Christian teaching are true and the other things are not true?
I wouldn't recommend that, not because I want to say everything in the Old Testament really happened, but because that too easily becomes a kind of Christian, we're better than you kind of thing. Another way of thinking, one of the big scholars in terms of the formation of the Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, that part of the Bible, he talks about it. Imagine that a town has been destroyed by an earthquake or by a conquest, and then people decide to rebuild. Now they're going to recycle as much of the building material as they can because it's expensive. And if you've got a nicely carved doorway, lintel, whatever, you're not going to throw it out and get a new one from Bunnings because there is no Bunnings. And so you're going to rescue any building material you can. Then you're going to level out the site as best you can without bulldozers and backhoes and so on. Stomp it all down, put a bit of water on it. Then you're going to reassemble the bits that you can from the old house, and where you need to, you're going to get new bits. And they may or may not be the same quality of material or the same quality of workmanship as the original house. And that, in a sense, that's what we've got in the Old Testament. In that they've got all this old stuff, which they've rescued after all the things that went wrong. They've rescued all these memories and traditions from the old folks. And they're putting it back together into a story that says who they are and what God means to them, what it means to be Jewish. And some bits of the story you say, yeah, that works. Other bits you say, really? That seems a bit odd at this stage. What's going on here? So it's not all that different from what you're saying, but it's not saying, well, the Jewish people got their bit of the Bible messed up and ours is all honky-dory. Because, ours might be a bit wobbly at times as well. It's just how ancient people told the story. And given that most people couldn't read and write, we'll talk about this someday, but when you look at an ancient book, it was handwritten, it had no gaps between the words, and it had no punctuation and no capitals. So imagine if your son sends you a letter and it's all written in capitals or it's all written in lowercase, and there's no gaps between the words, and there's no punctuation. When he gets to the end of the line, if the word is too long, he doesn't put a hyphen, he just continues the letters. See, I'm doing it from right to left, but the same in Greek. And then you've got to make sense of that. So most people didn't bother, they just kept it up here in their head. It was too hard. All right, so we're pretty well done for today. It's just a bit of a taster, really, today. But that's the kind of thing we'll be doing. We'll be exploring. If you've got questions, we'll look at those questions. Some of them, like the creation story, I'll say, okay, let's look at that in a few weeks' time, because that's actually that's a topic big enough to have its own Sunday. Yeah, well, it won't be the next couple of weeks because I've already got the topics for the next couple of weeks. Okay, so and I'm delighted that you're asking questions. Delighted to find what a minor biblical seriously a minor biblical school. We've never really had a conversation until today, so all you've done is smile at me and give me the thumbs up a couple of times. So excellent. I knew you were friendly, I just didn't know your story much. So thank you, it's been great. All right, so we'll call it quits, and we'll do a similar kind of opener. The big difference, of course, is the Old Testament covers, well, at least 1,000 years, maybe longer. The New Testament is only going to cover a few decades. Okay, so we're not dealing with hundreds and hundreds of years, we're just dealing with, even if you went from Easter to 100 years after, that's only AD 130. So you're not dealing with large dates. Anyway, let's call it quits and see where we go from there. You're welcome.